Hi, everybody. By way of introductions, I am Lauren, which you'll see on the next slide, and this is Rashida. And we are going to be chatting with you guys today about successful collaboration between people like myself on sales or consulting in Monday.com's case, and then people such as Rashida in the customer success realm. So we're going to be chatting with you guys about some of that, and then also finishing with some of our recommendations and takeaways that you all may be able to put into practice depending on your roles within your own organizations.
All right, so a little bit about what we do. So like Lauren said, I'm a customer success manager on the enterprise team. Lauren is an enterprise account manager, and we work on a total of 10 accounts together. So on those accounts, we have a couple of KPIs. We're going to go into those in a little further depth. But overall, we're measured on growth, expansion, which means, I guess, added revenue for the accounts that we work on together. WAP, if we refer to that later on, it's weekly active paying people. So that's activity within the account. And we crunched the numbers. It translates to about 770K of ARR.
So when it comes to our KPIs and the goals that we have to meet, specifically what I am measured on as a customer, or excuse me, as an account manager on the consulting team, is growth as it relates to account ARR. So we are measured on a monthly basis, which you guys may have seen in some of the earlier presentations, but also for an account manager quarterly. So I'm measured specifically on the growth that I'm able to contribute to those accounts that Rashida was mentioning.
Yep, and on the flip side of that, as a customer success manager, I'm more in charge of making sure that adoption is healthy. So usage is kind of increasing in a healthy way in the account as it expands with the work that Lauren is doing. So in doing that, the end goal is to secure the account, to retain the people on it, and to make sure that we're all set for renewal. So to that front, I have monthly and quarterly renewal KPIs. So, okay, why are we talking about collaboration today and talking about happy customers? So the first point that we have over to the left is that we strive to have a finger on the pulse of our accounts at all times. So this means if we are asked by somebody that we're working with inside the account, where are we at, or who are you guys working with? If they ask either one of us, we want to be able to tell somebody that answer with confidence so that they know that we work together and communication is solid between us. Otherwise, if we're not collaborating, it can lead to misinformation, details being dropped, us looking like we're confused, and to somebody that we're working with that doesn't have a very good impression. So we really think that a key to having a happy customer is showing that we know everything that's going on within the account.
And ultimately, if we don't collaborate, what does that mean for us? A big one would be lost revenue. So I'll kind of get into it a little bit later, but we have this idea internally called the Flywheel Process, which is the idea of landing and expanding different accounts. So if I were to find a group of users who are, willing, ready, and able to use Monday.com, they're ready to get going, Rashida might come up behind me, start training and onboarding, and in a perfect world, I'd be kind of landing and expanding into the next group. But ultimately, if we're not collaborating, direct impact would be lost revenue. The other big one is time wasted. If I'm trying to re-listen to calls that Rashida hosted with previous people to understand their use case, or if I'm messaging Rashida to say, hey, do you want to reply to that email or should I? Ultimately, it's a lot of wasted time for us, but also for the customer. If they're looking for an answer, we want to get back to them as quickly as we can. So, having to sift through notes and sort of look into all these details ultimately will correlate to lost time.
So apologies to anybody that wanted to just sit and relax during this session, but I do have a use case here that requires a little bit of participation. So I want to present you guys with something that Lauren and I did recently with one of our accounts that we work with. And it's this scenario that you guys have probably had in your lines of business as well, where you might add a new team to a large account of people that you're working with. So in this particular use case of somebody that we're working with, they're on a 400 license plan, and they've used 381 licenses out of the 400. And a new team of anywhere between 6 and 40, I know that it's a really wide range, but we were just unsure at the time. A new team of 6 to 40 expressed interest in joining the platform. So of the two of us, who should be taking responsibility here? Should it just be me? Should it just be Lauren? You can put in L if you think Lauren. You could put in R in the chat if you think me, or you could do both LR if you think that we should both be on it in the chat. Okay, Graham.
So far, so good. I'm agreeing with all of these replies.
I agree too. And I think it might even make sense because we're talking about collaboration, Lauren. So this group knows.
We're giving away the answer.
We're giving away the answer. Correct. Great. So we worked on it together due to the size of the opportunity. So from my hand, I was in the loop to ensure that the whole group, if it was to be 40, would adopt. Whereas Lauren was in the loop to ensure the upgrade. And Lauren, do you want to speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. Being kept in the loop in terms of the size. If I'm working with certain accounts where, let's say it's maybe just 5, 10, 15 people in an account of that size, I may take a little bit more of a backseat because I, A, fully trust Rashida, B, you don't necessarily need to be super involved in that. However, if we're talking about a large group of people that has a direct impact on the account overall, potentially on the decision maker who originally purchased the licenses, I definitely want to be kept in the loop.
Okay.
So that kind of brings us to our first point, which is what we want to do here is present you guys some of what we've kind of taken away in our interactions, specifically as it relates to this account, but with a lot of them. The first point we want to sort of drive home is being upfront and clear when you identify roles. And why are we being upfront and clear? Ultimately, we want to do this because it'll save us time. We sort of alluded to this earlier, but you know, if we're slacking each other again, being like, who's going to answer that email? Or if I'm waiting on a reply from Rashida in order to get them the information, ultimately I'm wasting time. So why do we want to be clear and upfront? Because we want to save time, but it also helps us to have a unified front. If we both know that we're both responsible for everything, obviously little bits and pieces certain people are more responsible for, but if we know that we're responsible for everything, there will be no one person, you know, just carrying the burden or the, you know, the questions of a particular customer. It also allows us to create a success plan and an action plan. A success plan when it comes to our KPIs, which we're going to get into, and we already did allude to that a little bit as well, but also an action plan specifically with a client. For example, on a kickoff call, if we know that I'm going to be in charge with helping their IT person get set up with single sign-on and Rashida's going to get going on training, we both know our roles and we can kind of act on that. So the screenshots below, just a little bit of that in practice, very much constantly identifying and reinforcing the roles that we have with a customer.
Great. And something that I forgot to mention, Lauren, on the previous slide is that that example that we gave in the beginning, we're going to be continuing with that example, just kind of showing you guys in practice each of these concepts that we're coming up with on these slides. So essentially the answer to the previous question was that Lauren and I work together on accounts like that, on teams like that, where there's a large opportunity for both parties, and in reinforcing those roles, just going into this next example. I, for one, would maybe send this email to the customer following a meeting that we had. So you can see in this example that I would essentially frame my use to the customer as somebody coming from the platform side. And I would focus only on the key needs that they're expressing and examine it more from a workflow perspective. But simultaneously, Lauren is sending an email about this client who came, and this again was the 6 to 40 people who might be interested in coming onto the platform. And she sends this message to our point of contact at that organization. So Lauren, I could summarize this. If you want to speak a little bit to this email, I'm also happy to have you do that.
No, go ahead. No problem.
Okay, cool. So Lauren, to our point of contact, is essentially framing the, I guess, game plan for what we're going to be doing with this team to our point of contact, so that while I am framing the game plan for the users to keep them focused on their own goals coming out of the experience of working with us, Lauren is framing the game plan from the point of somebody who's going to be campaigning for that expansion. So you can see here, we're communicating very clearly with the point of contact to let them know exactly what's on our mind. And it's kind of making it so that this isn't just our win, it's our win with our point of contacts if this goes according to plan. So that brings us to our next point, communicating clearly with each other and the customer. So the first point is near and dear to my heart. Since we work on 10 accounts together, we need to actively communicate, but we also want to make sure that in communicating with each other, we're setting good boundaries and we are, I guess, facilitating and opening for that conversation so that we know each party is prepared to take that on. So I don't even know how this began, but at some point or another, Lauren and I just started saying "morn" to each other. And we realized in talking about it that this was kind of an implicit way of saying, I'm prepared to receive the info/updates that you have for me at the beginning of the day. I usually start working around 8 a.m. Lauren maybe will start a little bit earlier than 9 a.m. on most days, but I don't want to ambush her with information before she's ready for it. And you can kind of see from the screenshots below, we see one instance to the right where I think we're both prepared to have a conversation, and then one instance to the left where maybe I'm super ready and maybe Lauren needs a couple more minutes. Yeah.
Additionally, when we communicate clearly with each other or customers, the second point here is being that if there is any email communication that may have big implications, that both of us are constantly CC'd. Very simplistic point, but again, it's sort of creating and continuing that open line of conversation after we've said good morning to each other, but making sure that, you know, we're both fully in the loop. The next points here in terms of when we want to communicate clearly, be clear and be concise and get to the point. And what I mean by that is that could be applicable to the customer, but also to Rashida, especially to the customer when it comes to things like email follow-ups. Both of us are very neurotic, for lack of a better term, when it comes to our follow-ups, because we know that very quickly before we're going to hop on another call, we refer back to our recaps where it's very clearly bulleted out our next steps, what we covered, what we might be covering, you know, in the future. So this helps us to play catch up on all these customer calls. So being concise and clear with the customers, but then ultimately that's going to help us being clear with each other. That feeds very much into the second point, which is documenting everything. It makes it much easier to recall. But then also Rashida and I, for better or for worse, are not huge fans of syncs. We don't agree with the idea of, and don't love the idea of just syncing for the sake of syncing. I think there's a lot of benefits you can get out of syncing. However, I personally find, and Rashida finds, that it can be a bit of blasts of information and information overload that can be easily forgotten later on. So I think if you can do less syncing, you'll find that less time is wasted. And this is assuming that you still have that open line of communication with each other.
And just showing how it's put into practice, just to set the context of what we're seeing here all the way to the left, starting with the first screenshot. This is an email from the client for the team that we were talking about before, thanking us for our time on a call that we had the previous day. And he addressed it to both of us. So he knows that we are essentially a unit working on this account. And the email is essentially about two things. It's about preparedness for the following sessions that he's going to have with us. It's also about the addition of more people to his account. So we responded to this email in different ways to essentially instill with the customer who is going to take on which responsibility, and to also be clear with each other. So Lauren, for example, stepped in first to talk about the account manager side of that conversation. So facilitating the growth that he needed in order to bring people into the account. I responded a couple days later, not really addressing that part at all about the users, but again, enforcing the knowledge of new features, helping him to learn a little bit more about the account so that in his mind, he's completely covered from our end. Looks like we have a question in the chat. Lauren, should we pause?
Sure. Yeah, this is actually a really good question, Dominique. We do not work exclusively together. However, we have some recommendations around this, which spoiler alert for the end. So I'll pause on half of my response, but no, we do not work exclusively together. We are partners in crime though. So I'd say maybe 70% of our accounts, maybe around that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And we'll answer that soon, Dominique. All right, so again, to that point of documenting everything that Lauren mentioned earlier, we find that documenting everything is just one component to supporting one another to hit our KPIs. And I'm gonna hit you guys with another example screenshot before going to the rest of that list. So for those who aren't familiar, this is a Monday board. And the reason that we made this board was because in our excitement to grow this same account that we've been speaking about, we didn't anticipate that we might get some pushback from the IT team internally. And the pushback that we got was, this account is growing too fast. It seems like it's happening without me knowing about anybody that's joining. And that's really not the way that it's supposed to be. I should have an idea of what's coming down the pipeline for people who actually want to use this service in order for me to partner with you. So it seemed like this was going to be something that could directly interfere with Lauren's KPIs in terms of future growth opportunities if the IT team was not on our side. It also seemed like, from my perspective, how am I supposed to continue working with the teams that I work with if maybe only 5 of the team is on board? How am I supposed to get the whole team to adopt? So we decided, based off of what we had documented about the work with each of the teams that we have, to make this visible to the IT team on the client side. So this actually is fulfilling multiple purposes. We're able to kind of signal the IT person to let them know when we expect more people to be joining from a particular team. And you can see that from the censored message that I put up on the page. But Lauren and I also use this to remind ourselves who all that we've worked with, so that at any given moment, we can easily reference this with our point of contact, so that we can, I guess, show that same united front and show that it's kind of like a receipt in some way that shows all of the work that we've been doing at any point in time. So now back to the bullet points.
This is actually an awesome transition, though, into what you're saying in terms of our KPIs. So we really want to be able to support one another in order to hit our KPIs. And it sort of brings us to the next point, which is, I mentioned it earlier, but this idea of the flywheel. We both need to stay involved at all times. So in that example I mentioned, and we have a little flywheel example down below, it's the idea of, let's say within this particular company we're discussing, I now move on to the fleet team and they express interest and they want to get started. Rashida would come up behind, give the opportunity of training, onboarding, and hopefully I've already moved on to trying to identify the next opportunity, which is one of my KPIs. We both need to stay involved ultimately in order for us to hit these KPIs. if Rashida, for instance, as I mentioned here, uncovers a new opportunity, and maybe I'm also getting involved in helping with the renewal, we both need to be involved and stay involved in this particular instance because we're both kind of working towards that same goal. I think it's also important to mention that without one or the other, there is no one or the other. So without the expansion, there may not be a renewal. And certainly without the renewal, there is not going to be any expansion. So I think it's very important that you support one another to hit your KPIs. It's not just, Lauren's focused on the growth and Rashida on the retention, but very much that you're supporting each other in terms of how you go about working with the different customers.
Great. And I wanted to add in this example also, just to show the impact of having people in our position work together. So we got this email from our champion at this account that we're working on together. This is again about that same team, the 6 to 40 big gap. And he apparently called our champion. And after a 20-minute conversation, he disclosed that he was super excited about what we showed him. And he was going to end up talking to his VP about the impact he thought that what we showed him could have. And rather than maybe being shortchanged, only offering seats to maybe 6 of the people on his team that would actually be working within the tool, he brought it to the VP to campaign for all 40 people to join. So even though this email says it was due to the persistence on my part, where I kept emailing this guy in order to get him on calls with me to show him the platform, it was Lauren and I together that were demoing the platform for him. And I did the email outreaches I did to this team so that Lauren and I could both benefit from it. So it's good for us, but it's also really great to see from the champion side, and even disclosing this information to us, that it's not just a win for us, it's a win for our champion as well. And this is just a nice graph, because you can't have a presentation without a graph that you need to explain. So what this is showing is the kind of growth that we want to see. So we can see that as users are being added, that's the dark purple line that we see below. We can also see that the activity is pretty much staying the same over time. So as new users are coming in, they're using the tool exactly the way that we want. And we are also seeing that growth that we want to see because of our collaboration over time. So this is showing us that not only are we doing well from an adoption perspective, we are also finding the collaboration we need from the IT side, from our champion side, in order to help facilitate that growth from their side. Lauren, is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, that was perfect.
Okay, cool. And at this point, I'm talking a lot, but I also want to say that it's not just a benefit from the champion side or from the account side. I think also having happy customers by collaborating the way that we do ends up helping also from an internal growth perspective because of the 2 examples that we see over here. So to the left, you can see something from my calendar that shows that Lauren and I are supposed to talk to new people in the company about the ideal collaboration between account managers and CSMs. So it's kind of like your reputation follows you from the good encounters you have into your workplace, because we want to be able to replicate that with other people. And to the right, we see another screenshot from a champion at our company, just kind of showing that it's not just one or the other, it's both Lauren and I that are being addressed here. And it's not the kind of email that you would expect from maybe a client that you work with. It's very familiar, and yes, he's one of the nicest guys in the world, but I think this also shows that if you have a happy client that you're working with, it has the opportunity to become something where it's a partnership that both parties would like to grow from. So Lauren, you want to take us to the suggestions that we have on ways to get there?
Yes, I would love to. So we wanted to try to come up with a few things in terms of analyzing how we work with customers to be able to pass some of this knowledge on. And I'd say a couple of these big points. So first one, and Dominique, I believe this goes back to your question. So do we work exclusively with each other? No, but we work a lot with each other. And one bit of information, or I'd say recommendation to any managers on the line right now, is if you can work in a similar pod structure to what we've developed here, at least in the US office, it is extremely beneficial. Everybody works very differently. Everybody has different means of communication. And I think if you can have a single person dedicated to each other, or a group of potential customer success managers dedicated to an account manager, I really do think that it is extremely beneficial, and it just can save a lot of time and some of the other things we mentioned. I would highly recommend this pod structure because you really can find a symbiotic way of working together. The next one that I'd recommend is making sure people have clearly defined KPIs. I know this sounds really silly and almost too simplistic, but I think if you don't know the KPIs, you won't be able to support each other. So first know what you're both being measured on, because that will allow you to equally support one another in terms of reaching your goals. The next one being have a united front. It immediately will reduce confusion and reduce friction. If you can have that united front on kickoff calls, in emails, on simple calls, you will really be putting yourself in a better position, I think. Again, showing that you're both in a united front, you have different roles, but you're seeking that same goal. I really do think it'll put you in a better position. And then the last one being that open line of communication. I know you heard me say it earlier, but syncs, we don't find syncs to personally work for Rashida and myself. Again, some of the information we're kind of waiting on, it creates these delays and these blasts of information that I personally have absolutely no way of retaining. I kind of like to take things in bits as I go. But we find to have this open line of communication to be so much more successful than these syncs, which almost at times we were talking about it can feel like they have a bit of hierarchy to them as well. Rashida's not reporting to me and I'm not reporting to Rashida. This is a partnership and we are working towards the same goals. So having this open line of communication, I really think it just allows you to get out a bit more of it than you would versus having kind of these intermittent conversations about big picture. I think you can get a bit more in the weeds, which ultimately will contribute to that big picture. Overall, we hope this was helpful. Rashida, anything else that you want to add in terms of suggestions here?
I think you pretty much covered it, but I think just to address Dominique's question earlier in a little bit more detail, even though we work on maybe 70% of the accounts we work on together, I do think that maybe not having consistent partners in crime, or maybe not getting to the partners in crime level with everyone is definitely more likely without a pod structure, if that makes sense. So just being able to practice that line of communication with specific people and almost get to the point where you know who's going to handle which responsibility, I think definitely takes a lot of the load off when you're trying to strategize to this level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree.
Right.
Well, that was sort of what we had in mind for today. I hope this was helpful, and I hope some of these, tidbits of information are going to be beneficial and applicable to you guys. We want to pause here for any questions. We also won't hold you hostage if you don't have any, but please let us know if you do have any questions. We're also happy to flip back to any slides that may be of interest. So we will pause here and hang out for a couple minutes in case anyone has questions.
All right.
Dominique, I'm loving these questions.
Me too.
I do feel very lucky to have somebody like Rashida. I will start off by saying that. It really came, I would say, from just being open with one another up front. I think in the beginning, I can remember actually a very early kickoff call we had with a customer where we both got in the room, and we used to take a lot more time before calls to prep. We'd sit down together and,
Yep.
write out our notes, who's saying what. as we did it more and more, that sort of prep time greatly reduced to the point of now it's sort of like a quick, maybe even telepathically communicated message to each other of what we're going to be discussing. But we ultimately developed it just by saying, what do you feel comfortable talking about in these type of calls? What are you good at talking about? Or what do you like talking about? What don't you like talking about? What do you want to absolutely avoid talking about? And I think by just having that open line of communication from the beginning and just talking to each other about what we need, it was really helpful, such as CCing each other on all these emails. I've run into other interactions with my colleagues where I'm not CC'd on things, and maybe they just didn't know that I really do like to be. I want to be kept in the loop. I want to see people's use cases. Just because my KPIs aren't retention, I want to make sure we are retaining them in a positive way. So I'd say open lines of communication. And how do we develop the communication? Just by talking to one another, by being comfortable being wrong. I think all of this kind of comes with that.
I completely agree on the being wrong part, because I think a large part of us getting to the way that we are is because we both ask each other for feedback on things. And it didn't just end at the time where we started feeling comfortable around each other. I think asking for feedback and looking to the other person as a peer and thinking, how can we merge the way we work together rather than molding to the way one person works, is a really good way to get to this kind of communication. And maybe that also leads into Jessica's question, which is what is the best way to implement? So I think that it kind of all starts with just knowing how each person works and trying to find a good balance between, so that once you have that structure that's in place, but of course there might be some organizational things that need to happen in terms of who gets paired off with who, things like that, which Lauren and I also had some ideas on. But anything you want to add to Jessica's question, Lauren?
No, I think you covered it perfectly. I do have another one for you. So we have a question from Natalie. We manage 10 accounts together. How do we know, or how do you know, Rashida, when you have the capacity to take on 12 or 15 or 20 with me?
So I guess it really depends on how this question is being asked, because I don't know whether it's about in total for the portfolio or whether it's just between us, how many we can both handle. But if it's the way that you interpreted it, Lauren, where it's just us together, where we can take on more accounts together, I'd say our calendars are pretty telling on that, right? If both of our calendars are pretty stacked with one account, then we don't have the ability to I guess, give another account the attention it deserves in order to game plan the way that we can. So yeah, that's what I would say from our end. It's really about the bandwidth as opposed to the stage of the account that we're in.
I'd also add that from my perspective, at least, outside of even just Rashida and I managing accounts together, I know that it was sort of obvious to me when I raised my hand and said, no more accounts. I can't take any more accounts. And we get accounts differently as account managers. Typically you're managing an existing book of business that won't ever change and you're only focused on growth. But in the beginning, you have to kind of build up those groups of customers. And I think calendar was very indicative, like Rashida said. I also think when you find yourself spreading yourself too thin on the accounts that matter, like this one we've shown throughout, that's when you kind of realize, okay, I think I've overextended myself a little bit. Rashida also looks at total ARR of accounts that she manages holistically. So not just with me, but with total ARR. And her manager and the customer success team overall wants to make sure that that remains even. So for instance, if they see that Rashida is overloaded, they may redistribute to a different customer success manager.
All right. And it looks like there's another question that we have about mitigating the risk of the organization from Natalie. So I'm just reading through that.
Yeah. So for instance, if one of us were to leave the company or our roles changed, how easily would it be to replace the Rashidas of the world? It would not be easy in this instance to replace the Rashidas of the world. She is undeniably irreplaceable to me. That being said, we actually recently had this change happen where somebody left the company and I had to have a few other people step in. I think it helps when your company hires such wonderful people. And I'm not just saying that as a plug for Monday. We've recently hired a couple of really fantastic customer success managers. Just to throw out their names in appreciation, Cassie has been fantastic, as has Adrian. When you have such wonderful people step in with this willingness to learn and with this willingness to try to make customers happy and feel comfortable and acclimated, I think that is a huge part of the battle. But I also think I'm happy to guide a bit and say, hey, here's how I typically work with Rashida. How do you guys feel about this, example, or how do you feel about doing it this way? It's not easy to replace it, but I think the best thing to do is just to quickly do the shift and immediately get on a call, get on one of those syncs. Give that other person the breakdown on where the account stands. And then it's just sort of getting in there and working. We do also have instances where Rashida will work with somebody else so they can kind of see her style. And not because we're trying to create a million Rashidas, but because I'm trying to foster the same work practices that Rashida puts into place when it comes to answering questions or, strategic calls. So I think it wouldn't be easy to answer the question, Natalie, but I definitely think there's ways to do it as long as, again, you're open to communication, open to feedback, and things like that. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that too, Rashida.
I also just think our penchant for documenting everything definitely helps, but we do feel the strain whenever one of us is out of office,
Yes.
maybe like to a lighter extent to if somebody leaves the company entirely, because working so closely with someone does kind of make you dependent on them. If somebody is asking a workflow question, Lauren would probably wish that I was around instead of out of office if she gets a question like that. Or if somebody asks me an account related growth question, I would want to make sure that I ran that by Lauren. So maybe there is a little bit of codependence there, and we would need to find a way to make it a little bit more stable. But I think documenting things the way that we do helps for other people to step in so that they can kind of see the history of what we've had with an account. And starting with other teams, I think it's exactly like you said, Lauren. If you're starting with new accounts, a new customer success manager or account manager, just kind of laying the groundwork for how you would like to be communicated with definitely helps set that standard.
Absolutely. Well, if there's no other questions, this has been super fun for both of us. I feel like, Rashida, I can speak for you and I say that too. This has been really fun, and I'm thrilled that you guys are asking awesome questions. I hope we're answering these effectively. We would love Barbara to host another one of these sessions. I think that would be fantastic. So we will pass that feedback on to the powers that be. I guess any other final thoughts, Rashida, or any other final questions to everybody?
No final thoughts from me. This is a great group. I'm glad we were able to do this. And thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day.